These days, getting from point A to B seems to be getting harder and harder, as the interstates become more crowded and air travel doubles down on fees and security. In the United States, transportation advocates have been studying and making cases for the country to invest in high-speed rail. Ground transportation that can soar at 220 miles per hour, with better seating accommodations than air and no traffic to put up with on the roads. So far, none of these attempts have been successful, owing largely to politics, bureaucracy, and our traditional culture around the car. What advocates and critics for high-speed rail may not realize, though, is that once upon a time, we had such a system operating throughout the United States. In the 1930s, the United States was in the depths of the Great Depression. With the economy at a standstill, businesses were shuttered, unemployment soared through the roof, and finding basic necessities like food, clothing, and shelter was out of reach for most people. To try and stimulate economic activity, the government created various public works agencies to manage projects for the greater good. One of the greatest projects was enhancing transportation, particularly in setting up a robust road network and helping the fledgling aviation industry get off the ground. For the longest time, though, the best way to get around was by rail, which was operated by over 100 or so private companies that ran on their own operating budgets with only marginal federal regulation. While the movement of passengers and freight in that time took a massive hit due to the Depression, now they were faced with forms of competition that were unthinkable decades prior. For an industry that had evolved continuously since the 19th century, innovation was the only way for railroads to keep their riders. On February 12, 1934, Union Pacific unveiled a new type of train at the Pullman Works near Chicago. It was classified as the M10000, but was named simply the Streamliner. Compared to the old heavyweight cars of the era, the affectionately nicknamed Little Zip was the culmination of all the latest breakthroughs in architecture and industrial design. To attain speeds as high as 110 miles per hour or greater, the train was built to be as light as possible and was among the first to be styled in a wind tunnel. Its outer skin was made from duralumin, the same type of aluminum-copper alloy used on aircraft at that time. The power car and two coaches were permanently coupled together by sharing one bogie, or truck, between the cars, creating a seamlessly articulated unit. Inside the power car was the biggest breakthrough of all, a 600 horsepower spark-ignition distillate engine. Internal combustion engines were nothing new to the railroad, though, being previously utilized with so-called oil-electric locomotives in urban freight yards and inside self-mobile passenger cars nicknamed doodlebugs. To promote this new breakthrough, the UP sent the M10000 on a nationwide tour, starting in Washington, D.C. for inspection by President Franklin D. Roosevelt. It was the same wherever the train went: Baltimore, Chicago, Kansas City, Denver, Las Vegas, and Los Angeles all had people lined up by the tracks to catch a glimpse, or around city blocks to get to see inside. UP Chairman Averell Harriman, speaking at the Little Zip's unveiling, proclaimed how this technology was available for all railroads to build their own trains with, and there could come a time when this type of train would become standard throughout the world. 2 months after Little Zip came the Burlington Zephyr, a slightly more advanced lightweight train finished in stainless steel and powered by the state-of-the-art diesel engine. This train would race in the headlines on May 26 of that year, when it raced from Denver to Chicago in just 13 hours and 5 minutes. The run was made with no stops and finished almost 2 hours ahead of its own schedule, hitting its top speed at 112 miles per hour. This run effectively cut the old steam era schedule in half. But steam was not about to be outclassed. For that December, the New York Central unveiled the world's first streamlined steam locomotive, the Commodore Vanderbilt. Although coupled up with old heavyweight passenger cars, its sheet metal shroud was forged to suppress air resistance by 35%, which would theoretically lead to greater fuel savings. What really made the Vanderbilt stand out was the fact that it could outpull the Little Zip and Zephyr by carloads. Because those internal combustion trains were built as fixed articulated units, they couldn't be lengthened or shortened according to demand, and they would quickly become victims of their own success. In just 1934 alone, these three trains had completely changed how the world saw its railroads. Germany was the only other country with its own streamliner, a twin-unit diesel railcar running between Berlin and Hamburg, known informally as the Flying Hamburger. In the coming years, streamlined trains were being introduced in Great Britain, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, and Japan, with the United States leading the way. These companies were either innovating in diesel technology or hiring industrial designers to design shrouding for their steam engines. Passenger car design was revised from the ground up, with new materials and techniques to reduce weight. Coupled together, the streamlined locomotives and cars blazed new journey times between cities, leaving the old timetables in the dust. Which would be the fastest of them all, though? The short answer is, no one knows. It's heavily disputed as to which railroad could have held that title here, but only a few lines were straight enough, long enough, and flat enough to travel safely at high speeds. The Illinois Central, Chicago and Northwestern, Milwaukee Road, Burlington, Union Pacific, and the Pennsylvania Railroad all rostered trains that were timetabled to run between 90 and 100 miles per hour. There are stories of trains running up to and over 120 in revenue service, but these runs were never officially recorded. Going above and beyond those speeds was seen as reckless handling, and railroads were fined if they were caught going over the limit. In the US, the fastest ever recorded run was at 127 miles per hour, with Pennsylvania Railroad 7002. But this record was set in 1905, at a time when a train's speed was measured by counting the seconds between passing mileposts. This makes speed records in the early days, like with the Empire State Express and the city of Truro, very sketchy because there's no formal proof of their achievements. The fastest steam engine that does have this recorded proof is the Mallard, which was recorded and verified at 126 miles per hour on July 3, 1938. The railroad's war on speed would be halted by an actual war, though, as the 1940s plunged the world into a fight for freedom. Moving troops and supplies to aid the combat took priority, and it had to be done with whatever pieces of equipment were lying around. Speeds plummeted, specialized pieces of rolling stock were mismatched, and attentive upkeep was reduced. Diesel technology was prioritized for military equipment. The locomotives that were built were prioritized for yard switching, but fewer railroads were able to make cases with the War Production Board to have new mainline power built, as long as they weren't dedicated for passenger service. As for streamlined steam engines, they were simply no longer in the limelight and would lose their cowling over time. Apart from being a nuisance for roundhouse workers, it was reckoned that the steel framework for the shroud alone would have added several tons of dead weight that would have negated any air resistance or fuel savings. In fact, the way the railroads were being run at this time was having a profound effect on passengers. Trains were crowded, filthy, and progressively getting worn out, often going without basic amenities like working air conditioning. With wartime demands having the route run at or well over capacity, railroads actively warned the general public to ride only if necessary. But the goal was to keep them rolling at whatever the cost. That exact cost would become known sooner than later. After the war, railroads set out to make the next era of rail travel better than anything before it. While some railroads could use speed to their advantage, the real object of upgrading their trains was refinement. millions of dollars were spent on the newest and best ideas in the industry. These included dome cars that allowed for panoramic views from on top of the train, and revolutionary double-decker cars for short suburban commuter runs and for long-distance name trains. To the passengers who rode, it seemed like there was no better way to travel. To the companies, though, there was a lot more to it than that. In years prior, passenger trains held certain advantages that earned them their most profitable years. In the 20s, road travel was hampered by unpaved roads and no uniform safety standards, while air travel was still in its infancy. This allowed for rail to maintain its superiority, carrying passengers at a healthy profit. In the 40s, gasoline and rubber was rationed for the war effort, further quelling any competition that rail would have faced, as they hauled, year on year, more passengers than ever before during the height of the conflict. Even as late as 1948, there was little to suggest that things would drastically turn for the worse. Interstate trains were mandated to operate by the Interstate Commerce Commission, which also set ticket prices and regulated their discontinuance. While some lines did the bare minimum to keep the mandates in good standing, others went above and beyond with brand new equipment, exceptional levels of customer service, and aggressive marketing aimed at demographics who would guarantee the largest return on investment. As long as these trains covered their operating costs, no expense was spared. Through all of the glitz and glamour, it was also hoped that these trains could create an inviting environment for guests who could also be potential freight customers. If they saw how well the railroad treated them, they might look into how efficiently the railroad carried freight, and just maybe sign on as a customer. After the war, though, only a few lines could see the writing on the wall, with road and air travel starting to take off again, and how their top-of-the-line passenger trains would be left in the dust. Some railroads started losing money on passenger trains as soon as the war ended. By 1951, industry giants like the Pennsylvania Railroad began openly referring to the situation as the passenger problem. With hardly anyone riding these money-losing trains, causing more losses for the rest of the companies, railroads had to ask permission from the ICC to have them discontinued. This wasn't always a straightforward process, though. Often, the ICC would side with the public, along with state and local governments, and insisted that the services be kept operating while offering no relief. In some instances, railroads resorted to dismembering interstate routes state by state through individual transportation departments. However, the ICC, in the face of losing the national network altogether, doubled down and further restricted railroads from discontinuing trains. While the 1950s was earmarked by a long decline in passenger service and ridership, the 1960s would mark the collapse. Construction of the interstate highway network and the introduction of jet air travel fundamentally changed the country's travel culture. By the mid-60s, the most reliable revenue source keeping most trains together were contracts with the U.S. Post Office Department. The trains weren't propped up by the mail contracts at first, but the rate stayed consistent as patronage dropped off. As trains were combined, long strings of head-end mail and express cars became the norm rather than the exception. Then, in 1967, the post office made the switch to airmail, effectively cutting off most passenger trains' last lifeline. The airlines, along with the interstates, had won the hearts and minds of the American traveler. Or had they? Some railroads still believed in making an effort. Like the streamliners before them, the few remaining innovators used cutting-edge technologies of the time to entice potential riders for a second chance. The federal government even pitched in by passing the High-Speed Ground Transportation Act of 1965. At a purpose-built test center near Pueblo, Colorado, all kinds of new technology was explored, including trains without wheels. Hover trains powered by gas turbines and linear induction motors were put through their paces here. with the ambition of carrying passengers at speeds of up to 150 miles per hour. That, ultimately, never happened. One feat that did emerge from the act was the Metroliner service between Washington, D.C. and New York City via the Pennsylvania Railroad's Northeast Corridor. Intended for speeds of up to 110 miles per hour, and later up to 150, the 2.5-hour travel time could challenge the short-haul flight business between the two cities. But because of the train's electrical issues, and the track not being up to proper high-speed rail standards, service would be held back at 100 miles per hour, never reaching its full potential. Some railroads took matters into their own hands, and partnered with various builders to create trains with their own specs. From this era came the Train X initiative, and tilting Togo trains like the Daniel Webster, Speed Merchant, and the Jet Rocket. In 1966, the New York Central tested an experimental rail diesel car, which had jet engines from a B-36 bomber bolted to its roof. On one of its test runs between Butler, Indiana and Steiker, Ohio, the so-called Black Beetle was clocked at 183 miles per hour, the fastest any train would ever go in the US. Although this form of jet power did not catch on, aircraft technology would soon find its footing with the turbo train. Introduced in 1968 by the United Aircraft Corporation and powered by a gas turbine turboprop engine, a test train would be maxed out at 170 miles per hour, the fastest run ever recorded by a mass-produced train in the US. These would be the most reliable of these later attempts and could be found in various corridor services throughout the US and Canada as late as the mid-80s. Despite the industry's best efforts, it still wasn't enough. Although speed was marginally increased, many of the new trains produced in this era did more harm than good with their poor reliability and rough riding, creating an unfavorable perception of high-speed rail. At the start of the 70s, most of the US's railroads would hand over their passenger-carrying responsibilities to a brand new, publicly subsidized, privately based company. Amtrak would be inaugurated on May 1st, 1971, inheriting the old, tired equipment from the freight railroads and operating on a national but skeletal network which would only grow thinner in the coming years. By that time, other parts of the world were miles ahead. Japan's all-new Shinkansen service had been in operation for a few years, which could move at 130 miles per hour between Tokyo and Osaka, while its network would be expanded over several years to connect the entire island nation. France was laying down the groundwork for what would later become the TGV, set to take off as early as 1981. Britain, France, Germany, and Japan were also exploring the potential behind hover trains and magnetic levitation. In places where distances were shorter and economies were still recovering from the war, not all travelers could afford automobiles. Today, most of the US's passenger trains without specialized equipment are limited to 79 miles per hour. On some lines, 90 miles per hour is allowed with automatic train stop, and fewer were recently upgraded to handle 110. The fastest any train can go in the US is 150 miles per hour, for all of 34 miles. On Amtrak's Northeast Corridor, two separate stretches allow for the flagship Acela Express to reach its top speed, one in Rhode Island, the other recently set up in New Jersey. For everywhere else, speeds vary between 135 for most of the way, and sometimes as low as 40 for crossing bridges and interlockings that are nearly 100 years old, especially east of New York. Because of this, the Acela covers the 457 miles between Boston and Washington, D.C. in 7 hours. By contrast, the TGV can cover a slightly longer 495 miles between Paris and Marseille in just 3 hours, as fast as 190 miles per hour. Maglev, despite only having one public route in Shanghai, is being further developed by Japan and China to achieve even higher speeds. As the world moved into the 21st century, more countries invested in faster trains, including Taiwan, South Korea, China, Russia, Morocco, Spain, and Germany. As for the United States, there have been attempts to formally introduce high-speed rail in California and Texas, and a maglev route between Baltimore and Washington, D.C. Most of them are still being studied, and the few that have moved past that stage face numerous challenges. With much of the US's rail network dating back to the 19th century, riddled with twists and turns, introducing a traditional high-speed rail line would mean building an all-new right-of-way that is straight enough to handle those high speeds. Advocates and planners must address land acquisition, funding for planning and construction, and public reception. Issues like cost overruns, slow construction times, and wavering political support can make or break an entire project. As it is, even contemporary systems are just barely able to cope with maintaining ridership and standards of quality. Things that may have been taken for granted in the age of the streamliners. Being nostalgic for such a system can make the average US citizen wonder, does high-speed rail really have a place here? It may not take on the same form as European or Asian counterparts, but there are efforts underway to upgrade what we have now, both in public and private hands. The private sector is making an especially strong case in South Florida. Brightline was inaugurated in 2018 as a higher speed rail service, meaning that trains are limited to 125 miles per hour. The train is currently shuttling back and forth between Miami and West Palm Beach at just 79 miles per hour. Plans are in the works to extend northwardly to Cocoa at 110 and Orlando at 125. The Orlando extension is literally groundbreaking, as an all-new right-of-way is being built alongside Toll Road 528 to reach the city's international airport. The total cost to build all of this is currently at $2.7 billion, but it's where the money is coming from that is unprecedented. Brightline's main backer was Fortress Investments, which for a time owned the Florida East Coast Railway. This is a privately owned freight-carrying business that originally gave up on passenger trains in 1968. As for operating costs, Brightline is making a bet on real estate. By setting up hubs like Miami Central, the site is home to retail space, offices, and residential tower blocks, all situated with connections to the city's metro mover and the metro rail routes that extend even deeper into the city. Here, people can live, work, shop, eat, and travel, all without needing to drive. Redevelopment is also being spurred at the system's other stations in West Palm Beach and Fort Lauderdale, with 2 more stops just starting construction in Aventura and Boca Raton. Although these new stations have public money paving the way, the largest taxpayer involvement has been with taking out loans known as private activity bonds, which allows for the state to help fund privately managed projects that would benefit the public, such as the Orlando extension. This company is using the same mechanism to get Brightline West underway, which promises to build a true high-speed rail line connecting Southern California with Las Vegas in 2 hours. Public support varies from state to state, but states like California, Oregon, Washington, Illinois, and Michigan have invested heavily in operating state-supported trains on well-traveled corridors. The Commonwealth of Virginia's plan is perhaps the most ambitious. In 2020, $3.7 billion was spent on acquiring nearly 400 miles of track from the Class 1 railroad CSX, and has since begun capital improvements to the state-supported services running southward from Washington, D.C. These include, but aren't limited to, building a new bridge across the Potomac River with more tracks for greater capacity, and widening the right-of-way to allow 3 or even 4 tracks for the increased number in trains to seamlessly pass each other without interference. Also included in the transaction is the roadbed of the former S Line, stretching from Petersburg to Norlina, North Carolina. With Virginia's ownership extending as far as the state line, the Commonwealth is partnering up with North Carolina in the unique bi-state agreement to relay the track all the way to Raleigh and have a dedicated passenger corridor for trains to reach 110 miles per hour. It doesn't compare with the high-speed systems overseas, but giving passenger trains their own space to operate on makes a ton of difference. As for the rest of the country, it all depends. In some places, efforts are underway to improve what we have now, or bring back service that was lost over 50 years ago. More often than not, though, most of the country sees rail travel as a relic of the past. The added struggles of setting up high-speed rail over here has not instilled confidence in the public. The ongoing consensus seems to be that if the streamliners couldn't survive the march of progress, how could high-speed rail be expected to sustain itself? The United States' previous high-speed rail network made their exit as the country was becoming infatuated with the freedom of interstates and the speed of jet air travel. Today, they are facing their own struggles, and most travelers are left stuck in the middle without a viable alternative. In states like Florida and Virginia, alternatives are taking shape, which could set an example for the rest of the country. As for the ever-controversial projects in California and Texas, there will always be challenges when it comes to building an entirely new railroad from the ground up. There is one thing to keep in mind with these ambitious projects, though. The US isn't the first to be hit with these setbacks. When Japan was first building its Shinkansen line during the 1950s and 60s, it ended up outgrowing its original construction budget too. It was labeled as Japan's Great Wall of China for how it invested large sums in a form of transportation that was dead on arrival. Once it started carrying passengers, though, it outran the car with ease and got passengers from downtown to downtown faster than planes ever could. It pulled the country closer together than any other mode of transportation, which the country now depends on. Speed is only half of the equation, though. If rail travel is to win back the public's trust, it also has to be dependable. Of course, that's hard to find here in the US, but that's not to say that it's impossible, as there are quite a few successful commuter operations sprinkled throughout the country. They may be oriented for rush hour commuters first and foremost, and the experience may differ from city to city, but places like Denver and Salt Lake City are operating on the same kind of groundwork that Florida and Virginia are working towards. What we have currently for a national passenger rail network is not perfect, but there is always room for improvement as long as funding and management allows. After all, going by train is more beneficial to the environment, more civilized, and more convenient for getting from downtown to downtown, or from downtown to parts unknown. Whether the speed limit is set for 79, 125, or even 220, passenger trains do have a place for transportation in the United States. They always have.